for your role. I thank you for your role as strategic advisors. And with that, let's just talk about the composition of the strategic advisors for a moment. That is done through the mayor's office and the city council and an appointment process. This is everybody who's there in a seat right now. And Elvis, do you want to describe a little bit about how that process works as seats come up for their expiration?
Yes, absolutely. And first, let me, good morning, everyone. And first, let me just make sure I tell everyone, I started to record the webinar just since we're missing so many HSSA folks, just so we can catch them up to speed. If that's okay with everybody, I apologize for not advertising that at first. So just know we are recording the webinar. Yeah, and I'll definitely talk about the process. So I think the three of you who were coming up to your expiration date for your term received a message from an automated message from the boards and commission, specifically from Romaine Pacheco. So basically, if you're interested and you're to re-up again, I'll talk to you anyway. I usually will ask you, hey, how do you feel about joining again? What are your thoughts? I meet with you first, and then I move forward to the mayor's office with Romaine Pacheco, where we start the process to get you reappointed. Generally, you'll have to reapply again as you did before. Luckily we have all your applications on file, since this is generally a new board. We don't necessarily have to go out and ask you to do everything again. We just talk to you, and then there's an interview process. If you were appointed by the mayor, you'll meet with Romaine Pacheco. She'll ask you a couple questions. If you were appointed by city council, Emily Lapel will reach out to you and set up an interview just to talk to you and really gauge your experience on the board so far. And that's really more or less it. Once you re-up now, as you notice, these terms were staggered. Now when you're reappointed, it's for a 3-year term. So we did that so we can always have someone here in coverage for the board. Any questions there?
Great. I'm going to keep us moving then. Thanks, Elvis. So the other thing that we wanted to do as we kind of restart with just at HSSA is talk about a new proposed meeting structure now that the strategic plan is finalized and we're moving into kind of a more regular meeting cadence with just you all. We wanted to have a little further discussion about what you'd like these meetings to look like. You are required to meet 6 times a year, which is every other month. So we're recommending that we hang on to the time slot that you've been meeting in, because it seems like it generally works well for people, although we might want to check in with that since we had some absences today. But I think that might just be because of that conference. So we're recommending 10 to 11:30 a.m. the 3rd Friday of every other month. And on the next slide, you'll see the dates for those. We talked with Daryl a bit and Britta about kind of the vision for what these meetings should be covering. And so we're looking at trying to send you an agenda about a week in advance so that you can prepare for the meeting with any other materials that you might need. And that way you'll also have some time to ask us if there are pre-questions you have or additional information you need from us. We also plan to be bringing you updated dashboards so that you can monitor the progress that we're making on the goals in the strategic plan. And we'll talk a little bit more about how Jennifer's team will be developing those and bringing those to you for your input. And then my team will also be bringing you communications that you can use to engage with your networks about what is happening at Host, what we're doing, the progress we're making. And also really importantly, so that you can be our feedback loop and be, out in the community talking about the work, but also coming back to us and letting us know what you're hearing about it. And then at each of these meetings, we'll be sure that we're leaving you plenty of time for feedback to advise us and to give us your thoughts and opinions. So making sure that each of our meetings include at least those things. And then we'll go over on the next page sort of how that cadence looks throughout the year in terms of like timing up with our budget process and the adoption of our annual action plans. And also there will be time for you to add on any additional topics that you want to discuss. Updates in the months that we don't meet, we'll provide via email. So if we've got an update to the dashboard on the months that we haven't met, we can send that out to you via email. if there are new, talking points we want to make sure that you have for being able to be out in the community talking about what's going on that are more current than the last meeting, we'll send those via email as well. Any questions about the meeting structure that we're proposing? Okay.
Hey, Sabrina, Daryl, quickly, and I think the HSSA board, we're going to have some informal meetings as well. We've talked about that, and so we're most likely outside of the business of the every other month. We'll meet separately, and so we'll share that with Britta and team when and how, and obviously folks are all invited. We most likely will be meeting again in November as HSA for a kind of an informal getting to know each other and get to know each other's families. So at least wanted to put that there as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Just to clarify, those are more intended to be like social
Yeah.
gatherings so that those who are not on the Housing Stability Strategic Advisors who are watching this publicly, available meeting, they know that it's not for doing the business or the advisement. It's really about building community.
That is correct.
And thank you, Daryl, for leading us as chair here.
Great. So then with the proposed calendar, this is kind of what we've put together in terms of 2022. And just want to speak to a little bit that in the past, we were hard at work on the strategic plan. And so the opportunities to engage in what the budget priorities were this year didn't look quite the same because we were working more on that 5-year vision for the strategic plan. So in a normal year like 2022, we hope it will be, the way that this will play out is that we'll be following along with the budget process and allowing for more opportunities for you all to inform that as we go. So what we're proposing for 2022 is starting with your January meeting. Daryl will lead us in a discussion about governance and how you all want to manage your governance for these meetings, which will include, if you want to use Robert's rules and how we're handling public comments. It will include how we're going to handle meeting minutes and all those types of things. So a more robust discussion on that to come in January. And then we'll also be doing some discussion about how we want to measure our goals and our progress on the strategic plan, reporting out what our initial dashboard mock-ups look like. Jennifer, do you want to add anything on that while we're on that? On your point?
Sure. Thanks, Sabrina. Yeah, so we are excited and starting to plan as a data strategy and policy team around how we'll report out on all of the existing plan goals and targets. We have all of those great metrics. So how we're tracking our progress. Certainly, we will need the first bit of 2022 for data to start to come in on those pieces. So our goal for January is to be able to show you some ideas of what it could look like so that you can have input on what visuals work well, like does this capture everything that you all would be looking to understand in terms of your ability to advise Britta and advise host. So looking forward to that conversation. And then as we start to get data in, we'll be building those actual dashboards and making them publicly available as we have in the plan. So that'll be something that we push out to you through those monthly updates, but also something that will be available on the website to look at any time.
Yes. Great, thank you.
I have a question. Good morning, everybody. And I apologize. I have a headache right over this eye. It's just right there and it's sending me messages. I am wondering, looking at the proposed 2022 calendar, I'm just not, I guess, seeing, or maybe I'm jumping in too early. Where is, it looks like we'll be discussing the budget priorities all the way down in May for the next year. And I guess my question would be is, why are we waiting so long to talk about the priorities? And at what point does the advisory board, address like the milestones that's required to meet, that would be needed to meet those budget priorities? Like, is it normal to wait 6 months into the year to discuss the budget priorities for the following year?
Yeah, Laura, do you want to talk about how that follows the normal budget process a little bit?
Does that make sense? I'm just asking. It just seems
Yep.
like a long time to wait for budget priorities.
It's a great question. Thank you,
Yeah.
Marcia.
I'll just note that one of our primary purposes today is to talk with you about budget priorities for this upcoming 2022 year. So the conversation today will help inform some of our planning for how we spend resources over the year of 2022. And so this target of having a conversation in May is really to help inform 2023. Because the budget process happens primarily during the summer and fall of the year ahead of the budget year. So today we'll be talking more about the upcoming year, and this conversation in May will be more geared towards how we further those pieces of feedback and budget into 2023 planning. So typically the budget process kicks off around June each year. And right now we're in the thick of the ends of a budget process for 2022. It goes from about June through November for the following year to get a city budget adopted. So this May conversation is anticipated to be ahead of the city process for 2023 to help make sure we're informed by this group's feedback as we enter those conversations.
Does that make sense, Marcia? Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess the concerning part, I get it that it's 6 months prior to before the year, and I understand that part. But I'm saying the discussion for the budget priorities, like even for 2022, we're talking about the discussion, the milestones, what needs to happen before it's made a priority. Where are those discussions being had? If that makes any sense.
It does. Laura and Sabrina, may I? And I didn't introduce myself for the folks on the call that aren't part of the HSSA board and host. My name is Daryl Watson. I'm the chair of the HSSA board. And Masha, thank you for asking the question. The schedule and timeline for host is really kind of their formal process as they try to link with the process for city council. That does not in any way, shape, or form stops HSSA from having dialogues throughout. So, for example, when we begin our action planning process in January and we begin those dialogues, we will be discussing priorities for the 2023 budget. We will be building on our dialogue from today's call on 2023's budget. We'll be building on our dialogue from today's call on the 2022 budget. So it is our anticipation for this board and everything that we do when we reach back into community, when we reach back out to host, that we are continuously having discussions about the milestones and priorities identified within the plan. And then we will officially engage with host starting in May in their official steps towards their city council process. I hope I'm not overstepping Laura and Sabrina, but that's my understanding. But we will be discussing stuff starting January.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm so glad to hear that.
That's a great way of putting it, Daryl. It's an ongoing thing that we'll be doing all the time, constantly. So it's just that, as Laura said, the official city planning around the budget starts in June. So we want to make sure that at the May meeting, we have a good amount of time to really dive into that and make sure that as we're going into that formal process with the Department of Finance and the mayor's office, we are all on the same page in May. So. All right, with that, then I'll just real quickly finish up with the proposed calendar. So yes, March, we'll discuss more on the pillar. Oh, excuse me, January, we'll come and talk to you a little bit more about our communications and engagement plans. And we have been asked to go over with you a little more on the expanding housing affordability program, which is something that the Department of Community Planning and Development is actually leading on, and we're participating in with them. So we will have an update for you that times out really well with their public process. And so they felt like January would be a good time to do that rather than today. March is time for us to discuss our pillars of work in more depth with you all. And then again, May, we'll talk about budget priorities moving into that process that happens in the summer. July, we'll go into how those budget priorities are going to inform our 2023 action plan priorities, and we'll discuss that in more depth. And then in September, we'll see what's in the mayor's budget proposal, and the action plan will be moved to public comment. And then in November, you will formally recommend the final action plan, we hope. So that's kind of how the cadence of the year will work out. There will be plenty more that will add to these agendas, but that's kind of the general gist of how the year flows in terms of process for budget and action plan priorities. Any other questions or discussion on the calendar? Great. All right. Well, now we're going to move into the fun stuff, and I'm going to actually kick it over to Jennifer and let her introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Weiss, the Director of Data Policy and Strategy for HOST. It is great to be here with everyone today talking about our 2022 action plan. So this is really our first step to take our 5-year strategic plan and identify implementation priorities for 2022, in addition to presenting our overall projected budget for 2022. So in terms of what you'll see in an annual action plan, we do present more detailed budget information than we do in the 5-year plan. So we're really looking at that upcoming year and what are the resources available, how do we plan to use them, and how will dollars go out the door that year. We also will have annual targets on things like our unit creation and preservation goals, and the identifying of all of the strategies in the plan. Where are we focusing this year, and what does progress look like? So our first chunk of time today, we're kind of going to go in that order and start with budget. So before we dig into some of the budget information, did want to spend just a minute talking about how the city budget book will differ from the projected budget that you'll see in the 2022 action plan. So the city budget book reflects dollars that will be expended or dollars that will be paid out in 2022 under our contracts. Because some of our contracts, like development projects, take multiple years, there might be a year that we make a budget assignment for a project, but those dollars may not actually get paid until a future year. So what that means is that the 2022 projected budget in the action plan will look a little bit different than what you'll see in the mayor's budget book. The action plan projected budget will reflect dollars that are planned for or that are available to be planned for and assigned to programs and projects in the upcoming year. And it will also include resources like our home grant from the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, and emergency rental assistance, or ERAP, that were still in process when the budget book was being finalized, and so they weren't in there. So you'll generally see, in terms of a big takeaway, a larger amount of dollars in the 2022 action plan because of some of those differences. With that said, wanted to highlight some expansions that we're excited about here in the 2022 budget book, so folks are aware of some of those highlights. First, HOST is continuing to expand our staffing to support this work. We will be the new home for the early intervention team. That is a city staffed street outreach team that is currently housed out of the Department of Public Health and Environment, or DDPHE. Those staff will be moving over to HOST in 2022, and that program is getting a significant expansion as part of our goals to address unsheltered homelessness. We've also really heard through our strategic planning feedback the importance of having dedicated support to move affordable housing projects through the permitting and approval process. And so we're really excited that this budget includes a multi-agency affordable housing review team. And so that's dedicated staffing in each agency to really focus on moving those projects forward. So HOST is getting a chunk of staffing for that, as well as other agencies like CPD, DOTI, other folks that are involved in the development review process. Additionally, we're getting support for program and capital investments. So in particular on the housing stability side, a program manager position to oversee our programming there, and then a program manager to focus on our capital projects. So things like shelter facilities and other capital projects that we're doing to make sure those projects are moving forward. So we're really excited to welcome some new team members and expand that work next year. Additionally, we received $1 million in innovation fund funding for a data system that would support prioritization policy, which will help connect folks who have been displaced or who are at risk of displacement with affordable housing. And it can also be a platform to really ease housing search for anyone looking for affordable housing. So we're excited to be creating that portal and doing that work so that we can implement that policy that's been in the works for quite a while. And then lastly, there are also a number of recovery resources, as we'll talk about in a minute, that support surge in housing development, shelter improvements, and other programs. So we're excited to dig in and hear from you all about how we're thinking about those resources and whether we're on the right track. Next slide. Thank you, Sabrina. So just before, again, we dig into the numbers themselves, wanted to set the stage with some of our budget context. So in 2022, we are continuing to work with our partners to respond to the COVID emergency while working toward housing stability. The budget reflects expansion of supports for residents experiencing unsheltered homelessness, strengthening our shelter response and infrastructure for recovery efforts. And then our budget is also complemented by recovery funding that supports housing development and preservation, shelter resiliency, support for rehousing and unsheltered homelessness, and eviction prevention.
I have a question. Are we permitted to ask questions
Sure.
right now? Okay. On that last slide, how are you measuring the reflection of those expansions? How is that measured to be successful, or what's going to guide your expansion efforts, I should say, in making sure that unsheltered homelessness, people that's experiencing that versus having those spaces available and no one occupying them? I'm just trying to understand how you're going to measure those expansion efforts.
That's a great question, Marcia. I can take a first stab at that, but certainly would welcome anyone else from the host team to add to that. I think with
and I apologize if this is not the time for questions and answers. Let me know. I'll write my questions down and wait to the end if that's what we're supposed to do. But for me, right when I see it is when I need to address it. So just let me know.
Yeah, that's fine for you to jump in. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's a great question. How are we measuring success? How are we understanding the impact of the funds that we put out? I think with recovery funds, as we would for our other funding sources, we're really looking back to that impact framework that's established in the strategic plan as a way to identify what's important to measure in terms of our outcomes and our impact. And so for things like investments to support residents experiencing unsheltered homelessness, we're looking at how many people are moving on to housing through their engagement with any programs we would expand there, right? That ultimate outcome of getting back into housing. For things like eviction prevention, we have our goal of reducing that eviction filing rate by 25% over 5 years. So what is that eviction filing rate looking like year over year? And so what we do within HOST is kind of understand how these different activities plug into that impact framework, and then that helps us think about how to measure. Some of those things do take longer to change. Some of those measures are longer term, but that's generally, I think, how we are approaching that in terms of what we're putting in contracts for reporting to understand and kind of do performance management and those pieces. Is there anything else HOST folks would add to that? Does that answer your question, Marcia?
It does. I'd like to just dig a little deeper into the changes. And one of the reasons I'm saying this, and my biggest concern is how individuals are experiencing homelessness and are still homeless. And at what point do we, are we able to adjust and make changes and move forward? Like how quickly those processes. I fear that we'll have families, single parents that are experiencing homelessness, and because this is a single parent and not a person that is experiencing abuse with substance, they won't be able to get that particular shelter when needed. Does that make sense? Versus just understanding, okay, if we have 5 units or 500 units for people that is experiencing homelessness due to substance abuse, or they need rehabilitation, versus units that's available for mental health concerns or single parent or domestic violence. I mean, is there some shift where units are just available for those that are unsheltered and not in specific buckets?
Actually, that's a great question. We have a slide in the deck and we're going to go into more depth on units. So I'm thinking, given your specific question, and Jennifer, let me know if you disagree, but I'm thinking let's hold that until we go through that section and see if that addresses your question, Marcia, but please let us know.
Okay. That's been my whole life in school and everything. They're like, wait a minute, Marcia.
You're way ahead of us. No, it's okay. We'll get there. Let's see if we get it addressed. And Angie, we're gonna try to figure out why we can't hear you, because we can't. So let me see if we can get you unmuted by your section, but we'll let Jennifer keep going here on this section of the plan, and we'll come back to that.
Thank you.
All right. So then just a little bit more about kind of the nature of 2022 and our ongoing emergency response. So approximately $85 million have been obligated from FEMA for emergency shelters, so our COVID response emergency shelters from the start of the emergency through June of 2021. Host and the city are extending emergency shelters through 2021 and into 2022 where appropriate. And cash flow, because FEMA is paid back to the city on a reimbursement basis, we cash flow those expenditures up front. And that has been supported by the Coronavirus Relief Fund, the city's COVID Special Revenue Fund, and the Homelessness Resolution Fund. And through those investments so far, we've served more than 7,000 unique folks through those FEMA-funded emergency shelters through this since the start of the pandemic. So now just digging into the actual budget numbers, as I'm sure folks are curious to see. So this is there's a lot of numbers on this slide. So this will be something maybe to spend a little bit more time with, but I will hit some highlights. So first, this slide is meant to show the growth in our budget over the past couple of years. So the 2020 budget on the farthest to the left reflects the budget for the housing division before the creation of Host. So you can see we had general fund, we had affordable housing fund, federal grants, and a small amount of other funds. All of that came together for just under $50 million. 2021 was the first year that the Host budget was really incorporated as a single agency in the city budget book. So this reflects both overall new funding sources and growth in our funding, but also the combination of resources that previously were in other parts of the city. And so you see a pretty significant expansion to just under $143 million in terms of our projected budget for this current year. Importantly, the yellow bar there is the Homelessness Resolution Fund, which was passed by Denver voters in November of 2020. So 2021 was our first year with those dollars. You also see growth in the affordable housing funds, an increase in our general fund and growth in federal funds in that 2021 year. Oops. And then for 2022, obviously, we're also seeing a big growth this year as well, for a total budget, a total projected budget of just over $270 million. As you can see, a large chunk of that is due to recovery resources. While we're seeing some increases in things like the general fund and the homelessness resolution fund and the affordable housing fund, the big growth is really in that COVID response area. Those are shaded in slightly different tones of gray, if you will, because some of those resources are currently known that we have, and others are more in process or need to be passed by Denver voters. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on a future slide.
And Jennifer, I do want to just be mindful of time. So we're going to try to rush through some of the rest of our slides.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool.
So this just very briefly shows you that recovery dollars do not need to be spent in 2022. So we're talking about the total amount that's available, but it doesn't all need to go out the door this year. They can be spent over different time horizons, and those are on this slide. But we'll go to the next slide in the interest of time. This shows the breakdown of recovery funds. The just under 11 million for Home American Rescue Plan Act is not yet, the grant is not finalized, so that's more lightly shaded, but we do know that we have the state and local revenue for American Rescue Plan Act, which is about 50 million, and about 27.5 million for emergency rental assistance. If the bond passes, we would then have an additional 38.6. Just briefly, because a large ERAP or emergency rental assistance, this really builds on the foundation of our temporary rental and utility assistance program, or TRUA. We contracted for just about $21 million in the first tranche of ERAP last year, and are continuing to support staffing for the program and also invest the additional $27 million from the second tranche to help keep people in their homes and help people with rental payments that they need to make. Next slide. This is how we're proposing to use our American Rescue Plan Act dollars. So this includes an infusion of into the Affordable Housing Fund to support development, acquisition, and preservation for $28 million, investment in shelter alternatives, so things like safe outdoor space, tiny homes, and safe parking, housing stability supports to help folks prevent eviction and stay in their homes for $1.5 million, and $2 million for rapid resolution rental assistance and services to help people with rehousing. So that's about 35.8 million, and then about just under $15 million in different capital improvements. So commercial kitchen and clinic out at our 48th Avenue shelter, emergency preparedness, updates to rec centers to really make sure that we have those resources available and ready in the event of severe weather or other emergency. If the GO bond passes in the fall, we would have an additional 38.6 million for housing and sheltering. This would support a purchase of the 48th Avenue shelter that the city is currently leasing, as well as 30 million for shelter facility acquisition and improvements to really continue our non-congregate shelter strategy that's able to bring more folks inside through that model and also provides more housing-like supports. And it would support more than 450 guests in 24/7 or around the clock shelter.
Let's just pause there and just want to make sure, do we have questions on that big picture? Because that was a lot of numbers getting thrown at you. And then we're going to transition to go more into the action plan and talk a little bit more about how those dollars actually fund the different pillars of our work, which I think is what Marcia was getting at, and to like really take a look at like, where do those dollars get spent for programming, and get some more feedback from you there. We good to go ahead? All right.
Well, Sabrina, before we jump, Jenny had several things in the chat. So Jenny, maybe let's just bring those out so folks who may not be reading the chat can hear.
Sure. One, that was a great overview, Jennifer. I would love to look at the slides later just to absorb it even more. I was curious, I know you mentioned And I know that FEMA works on a reimbursement basis. So, and I think Laura answered my question, but I was trying to figure out if CARES Act funds were used to cover the cost of hotels and other homeless strategies as you wait for FEMA to reimburse at some point, if you then will able to recycle those CARES Act funds back into other cost categories in the host budget. That was my first question. And I think, Laura, what you said is yes, although it's not that easy to, it's not just that simple, right?
Yeah, happy to take just a moment. So we utilize resources like the coronavirus relief funds and resources from our homelessness resolution fund that are locally resourced to help cash flow emergency shelter costs to then get reimbursed by FEMA. As those come back to the city, they can be reimbursed, reinvested, and cycle forward. The coronavirus relief funds have been primarily helping us to, as they come back, cash flow for emergency shelter costs to then get reimbursed by FEMA, and then cash flow emergency shelter costs. So those do have a deadline of the end of this year as far as expenditures, and have been helping to cycle through that cash flow. But if they were to come back, they could be utilized on other things. But the homelessness resolution funds are local dollars, which are still helping to get cash flow of emergency shelter moving. If and as those come back to the city from FEMA reimbursement, they will be available for housing investments into the future, which could be into 2022 as this continues.
Great, thank you. And then my other question was, as I was looking at the bars, adding various resources to your budget and the amazing growth, which is great. There was a green bar of other resources, and I just wasn't sure what was getting added on. It looks like it's in 2021 and 2022. And I was wondering if that's a long-term resource or if that was something Corona related.
The other funds bucket primarily reflects what we call special revenue funds, which are more historic and smaller funds that are not dedicated sustained resources. So it's really the local funds, the dedicated resources, and the federal funds that recycle for the most part. But we do have some smaller grants that we may have received. A grant agreement where an organization contributed to the work of the city on housing or homelessness, or a historic fund where it might have received program income from historic loan that paid off that might have contributed to that being an increase for 2022.
So it's sort of the catch-all of other funds. Got it.
It's the other special revenue funds that are.
Okay, thank you.
And happy
Laura,
more
is there an
detail if you have questions
addendum
about
of
those.
those special revenue funds by chance somewhere? Okay, all right, that's good.
Yes, and they are in the budget book listed each individually by name. So they're in that link that I included earlier in the chat.
Okay, great. We'll keep pushing forward then.
So just a couple last slides on budget as kind of a transition into our action plan content. This shows how that revenue for 2022 is anticipated to be spent by our pillars of host. And so you'll see this provided for our overall projected budget, and then separately for the Affordable Housing Fund, the Homelessness Resolution Fund, and then we've combined other funding sources that aren't those dedicated resources into that other column. So you can see the share that's going to housing opportunity, stability, homelessness resolution, and operations. I do want to call out the 41% in the Affordable Housing Fund is a DHA payment for the D3 agreement. So just want to explain that a little bit. So we have bonded the property tax portion of the Affordable Housing Fund to support a pipeline of housing in coordination with Denver Housing Authority to create additional supportive housing and additionally support that pipeline of DHA housing. And so that portion goes to DHA for them to do work in creating more affordable housing for our community. But that piece is just called out separately in that column. Next slide. Similarly, this shows how those revenue are planned to be used across different program types. So we have, again, that same structure in terms of how we're looking at different budget categories, but overall in our total budget, 46% is going to shelter and services, 18% is going to housing assistance programs, 30% to unit development and preservation, 3% to administration, and 3% to that DHA payment. And this really reflects the fact that we are continuing to kind of come out of that COVID emergency and the sheltering pieces that we are needing as we transition from that, as we kind of talked about in the framing. And then this is really where we're getting into the contents of the action plan. And so the slides for today are meant to identify high-level priorities, not necessarily an exhaustive list of everything you'll see in that draft action plan. So just wanted to provide that up front. This slide shows the work we're planning for 2022 in terms of our commitment to advance equity. That includes drafting baseline language and amending contracts to reflect racial equity and articulated as a desired primary outcome in our contracts, advancing our prioritization policy and supporting that data system development, marketing our rental assistance programs to improve access to those services, increasing the staffing and representation of host staff as we continue to grow, utilizing our eviction data to evaluate neighborhood eviction rates and inform resources and outreach targeting. And in a similar vein, really overall and across the department, improving our ability to use data to advance equity. So tracking households served by race, ethnicity, comparing that to households we think should be in need of services so we can see how we're doing in terms of access. Also looking at outcomes across the board. Also developing an outreach strategy to target residents in neighborhoods most in need that removes barriers to access like language, lack of internet access, so that we're really getting our word out there in terms of how we can help folks and getting that out to everyone who needs it. And also similarly ensuring that materials are co-created and translated to reach Denver residents who may not speak English, prioritize language access, and culturally appropriate messaging. Next slide. So just some highlights in terms of our key equity work and accomplishments. As you know, the plan includes goals to increase BIPOC homeownership rate from 41 to 45% over the next 5 years. So we're hoping to start that work this year and march toward that goal. And again, advancing prioritization policy and focusing on families, increasing the number of families getting to housing from shelter and outreach programs from 25 to 50% by 2026. So just calling back to how those goals relate to our ability to advance equity. Next slide. In our housing opportunity space, next slide. This again just shows those highlights around what we're doing in this first year of the plan. And the next slide will have those unit breakdowns that might get to some other questions. But in terms of our first goal, we aim to create and preserve at least 1,300 rental and for sale homes, support the passage and implementation of expanding housing affordability, which would create mandatory housing requirements for all all development, use ARPA and planned to fund planned units to really, we have units in the pipeline that we can use our ARPA funds to make more deeply affordable and meet those affordability needs for those at the lowest income levels. So that's a priority for the next year. Hire and implement our portion of the affordable housing review team to help move those permitting and approval processes more quickly. Release procurement for an administrator for our locally funded voucher program. So that is a key strategy in this 5-year plan. And so we plan to have that procurement out this year, as well as launching a new social impact bond type funded supportive housing initiative, this time focusing more on healthcare and housing. And lastly, continuing to explore those innovations around how we can use hotels and motels in conversion to affordable housing. And there are a couple of things on this slide that are actually on the next slide. So apologies for some of those pieces not yet being filled in, but we have our preservation goals around goal 2 in terms of rental and for sale homes, which we'll get to in just a second. starting to work on our updates to the preservation ordinance to improve our ability to preserve affordable housing, and implementing a capacity building program, developing and implementing a capacity building program for smaller landlords. In our home ownership space, in addition to our work to increase supply, the team is also working to develop housing resource videos that will be used to target our outreach strategy, inform residents about the resources available to them to become homeowners. And we're also looking to target down payment assistance programs and financial education to neighborhoods or households impacted by historic redlining practices. So looking to start that work this year. Next slide. As promised, here are those unit breakdowns. So we are looking to support about 1,350 total units in 2022. This is really helped by the availability of those recovery resources for us to be able to do more than we could with just our base budget. So this includes the construction of just over 800 apartments and over 100, or in the preservation of over 100 apartments. The preservation of 67, or the new construction of 67 for sale homes and the preservation of 83 for sale homes, the development of 185 units of affordable housing, 252 units that are affordable to households at 30% AMI and below, and 63 3+ bedroom units. There's also the opportunity for some additional acquisition opportunities for naturally occurring affordable housing or hotel acquisition opportunities, which we're benchmarking at around 46 units right now.
Do you want to pause here and go over any of those since Marcia had previous questions on them, or do you want to keep pushing through?
Why don't we keep pushing through and then we can
Okay.
come back to that at the end.
Okay, great.
So this next slide just shows similar outcomes, but from our budget book presentation. So just wanted to show this and pause to say that the goals that you'll see in the budget book are a little bit smaller than what's just on the previous slide. And that is because our action plan will include those additional recovery fund resources that are not included in the in-host portion of the budget book. So just wanted to explain that difference and why you'll see a larger number in the action plan. In terms of our housing stability work, some key strategies for the next year include beginning that work to explore and identify additional funding sources. So we're prepared to support that work beyond the expansions we've had during the emergency, while continuing to leverage ARPA funding to support investment impact work, and benchmarking community mobility through a citywide analysis of Denver public schools data. In our second goal to reduce evictions, we are using, as we talked about, ARPA to expand eviction legal defense and really looking to target our outreach programs, particularly ERAP to households most in need. And lastly, in goal 3, working on building that partnership with the state, which really has a wealth of homeownership assistance funds, and benchmarking our current rate of foreclosures in eviction or in income restricted. And this slide just shows our 2022 objective in terms of the total households served in stability programs, which is just over 6,000. And you can see a significant increase than previous years based on those additional funds. In our homelessness resolution space, number of goals. So we've talked a bit about some of this already. But in our goal to reduce unsheltered homelessness, continuing to invest in alternatives to congregate shelter like NCS and safe outdoor space, transitioning the early intervention team or EIT to host and expanding that to increase our outreach presence. And we also received an expansion of overnight hotel vouchers to provide safety and overnight places to stay for folks with barriers to the traditional shelter system. And our second goal around rehousing, similarly, this is kind of a complementary piece across the department. Excited to launch our SIPRA, that's the Social Impact Bond funded supportive housing program, as well as continuing to participate in Built for Zero and work toward functional zero for veteran homelessness. In our shelter transformation space, looking to identify potential locations and plan for implementation around shelter access points, assess sheltering best practices and what's working with our partners, and assessing training and technical assistance needs to make shelter spaces inclusive for all, including LGBTQ+ guests and those who need ADA accommodations. For our family system, we are looking to, again, assess options for access points for families, coordinating with our other providers and systems like the ERAP programming, Denver Human Services, and Denver Public Schools. And across all of these goals, there's that underlying focus on improving our HMIS data quality and moving toward our quality real-time data goals. And this is some of our planned outcomes for 2022. So as we have the 2022 point in time count, seeking to get the shelter utilization rate in the pit back up to 80%, and expanding the number of people housed, or having the number of people housed come through at least 1,400 through our host homelessness resolution programs, and 900 coming through One Home for Denver. In our operations space, working kind of across all of our goals to meet these important needs. So developing our processes for getting community feedback, developing and implementing communications and community engagement plans, leading our citywide efforts in communications around how the city works to address homelessness, in contracting, finance, and procurement, looking to improve transparency in the procurement process. So starting to build out those policies and procedures, provide greater stability and funding by executing multi-year contracts where appropriate, and improving efficiency and transparency in terms of how folks work with host. In our data space, as we talked about already, planning to launch that publicly available dashboard on outcomes in 2022, as well as a dashboard that really shows our finance data in terms of available budget and expenditures. We will also, again, be funding and implementing that data system for prioritization policy and affordable housing search, and working with our partners to clarify reporting expectations, make sure we're checking for data completeness, and prioritizing training based on where folks need additional training. In our citywide and regional approaches, again, focusing on the regional use of HMIS and advocating at the federal and state level for affordable housing supports, including voucher programs. So lastly, just takeaways. Host is continuing to work across all of our areas of work to address what the community is concerned about and has asked us to address, expanding strategies for those experiencing unsheltered homelessness with project management, outreach, case management, transportation, translation, and other services, scaling infrastructure to meet the growing portfolio of staffing needs, and furthering the city's equity goals as those experiencing homelessness and housing instability are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and people of color from historically marginalized communities.
Great job, Jennifer, getting us through that whole thing. You flew. Thank you so much. Great job. So yeah, now time is for discussion and questions. And Daryl, do you want to lead this section here for us?
Yes, Sabrina and Jennifer, thank you again. I know that was a lot of information and really appreciate how you actually brought that together so folks can kind of digest and have a sense of where the priorities are, the action planning steps following the 5-year plan. But definitely want to open this up for questions. I do want to state several of the HSSA board members are attending a Housing Colorado conference in Breckenridge. I think it ended today. Folks are coming down the mountain. Some of them wanted to call in. I told them don't. So we don't have all of our members here on the call. But for the folks that are here, and I'm looking through the list, and I absolutely have some questions. So maybe I'll start this off, but I encourage the members of HSSA to speak up. So to host, one of my initial questions on kind of the seismic growth within host, and I see also Melanie's hand is up, and I think I'm going to be asking a similar question. I wanted to talk to the action planning around operations, and specific to HMIS, and specific to the dashboard that's forthcoming. for the funding for or the review of HMIS and kind of data integrity that goes in, under the operations focus, what are the steps that hosts will be taking to ensure that not only that service providers, but any inputs into HMIS, that there's some level of data integrity from the input stage? And I ask that because a lot of our targets or milestones are impacted by the outputs from HMIS and actually the outputs into the dashboard that's going to be developed. Can you talk us through, are there additional dollars going towards that piece? Because if data going in is, I will use the term corrupted, which may seem rough, but if data going in is corrupted, the data coming out and going to the dashboard and going towards dollars within the dashboard will also not have the level of integrity for us to really see growth. So help us with that. What's that step and how does that look?
I can maybe start with that, and then Angie, if there's anything that you would add to that, would love to hear your thoughts as well. So in terms of our work to support our partners in the use of HMIS, there is not additional budget for staffing support for that. That is work that happens within the existing staffing of the data strategy and policy team. We have a lead analyst for homelessness resolution whose focus is on that part of our work, as well as additional staff available to support. But we do have a number of partners who are inputting data into that system. We collect what's called a data quality report. It's a report that HUD requires that providers can run for themselves that checks for things like completeness. We put in contract requirements around timeliness. And so we're collecting those things. I think in the next year, we really want to be able to dig into that more and prioritize that more as we stand up some additional infrastructure pieces. The other thing I have found in my work is that data quality improves as we continue to use it. And so we have our partners reporting directly. We get their data directly from HMIS, and we have a pre-populated report that host sees and the partner sees in terms of how they're doing on performance measures in their contract. And so that's a good measure for folks to be able to make sure they're getting that data in because it is what's used to assess contract performance. So we have those existing pieces. We're looking to really focus in on where we know folks need additional training support, but also as partners are coming online who are setting up a new program or are new to HMIS, our team also does kind of provide some, TA technical assistance to kind of help them get set up, help them get connected with Metro Denver Homeless Initiative, who actually runs our HMIS system, make sure that they're setting up their program interface in a way that's consistent with their reporting needs. So we do provide that support to partners currently, and we'll continue to do that. Angie, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, can folks hear me? Yes, okay. I think the key thing is all of our contracts in the homelessness resolution space require participation in HMIS, and as Jennifer noted, do have benchmarks related to data quality, and part of the monitoring is looking at data quality and looking at participation in HMIS. We are also in some great discussions with some of our external outreach partners with the Denver Street Outreach Collaborative about how to increase their utilization of HMIS. For many reasons, a lot of the folks that they interact with choose to be input into the HMIS system as private, and that can be challenging for some of the cross-system view. And so they're really at the table working to find solutions for this. And then as we expand internally to the city, our outreaching efforts through the early intervention team, they're also getting trained in HMIS, and we'll have that be part of their ongoing practice. So I really think what Jennifer said about one of the best things we can do is just ensuring that all of our partners are using that system.
That's helpful, Jennifer and Angie. And I know, Melanie, you had your hand up, so maybe I'll ask and I'll follow up and I'll see if there's any other questions from HSSA members.
Perfect. Thanks, Gerald. So my question was around the item in the operations section about supporting prioritization and the housing database. And I was just curious if you could speak more to how, what that specific strategy, how it either does or doesn't interact with some of the regional conversations around one home and a interface or database to support housing unit identification and access.
That is a great question. Because yes, they are a lot of similar words and slightly different things. So thank you, Melanie, for the opportunity to clarify that. So prioritization is, and maybe to step back in case we have folks on the phone who aren't familiar with One Home. One Home is our regional coordinated entry system for housing resources for residents experiencing homelessness. It's managed by Metro Denver Homeless Initiative on behalf of our 7-county Metro Denver region. Host housing program, homelessness resolution programs that are housing related do go through that One Home system for at least a portion of units or program slots available. So we're continuing to use One Home for those resources. Prioritization policy is a policy that cities across the country are starting to use to help create space for residents who are at risk of involuntary displacement or who have been displaced, have an ability to apply for and have priority for newly developed or preserved affordable housing in their community. And so it's for folks, residents in general. So it can include folks who are experiencing homelessness, but also residents of Denver or who have been displaced from Denver. And we don't have a system that really supports that or kind of a portal to show where affordable housing in Denver is located in general. And so that data system is really meant to provide that overall portal and support an implementation of a prioritization policy focused on involuntary displacement. And supportive housing units, I think, is something that would continue to go through One Home and would not be impacted by that. Does that help?
Yeah, that's I was wondering how much it was in the homelessness resolution space versus some of the other spaces. So that's really helpful. And I was thinking of, is it Housing Locator? Is that the system that the state and MDHI are looking at specifically in the homelessness space that's meant to get more units online that folks with vouchers or other subsidies could access? So then when you said database, I was curious if there was overlap in that specific, sounds like software solution that could help facilitate some of that process.
Yep, and we're looking at kind of what is that current landscape right now? What do we feel like we need in terms of effective implementation toward those goals? And so that's definitely on the radar as a complementary project.
Perfect, wonderful, thank you.
And Jenny, and thanks, Melanie, for that question.
Hi, thanks, Gerald. This is a kind of in the weeds question that I have about housing production in general and investments in producing new units, especially on the rental side. I've been hearing some from the nonprofit housing industry and housing authorities that they have some real challenges with those investments from Host and the State Division of Housing being loans and not grants. So I was curious, especially with the ARPA funds or with the expanded resources, if I didn't know if Host is going to a new policy of all loans that bear interest, or how those investments are being made, and if there's any consideration of flexibility on your guidelines for investing in new units or preservation in this next year. That might be Deborah or somebody else.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I mean, we're right now in kind of deep discussion about lending policies and guidelines. I think we've been looking at projects that have the ability to repay so that we can continue to revolve funds. But depending on what developers can do as far as deep affordability, those are usually either grants or forgivable loans or performance loans. But we evaluate them based on the alignment with what we're seeking, which is really the deeply affordable. So the deeper they go, the more likely it is that it's not repayment. If it's a project that is cash flowing very nicely. We usually look for some form of repayment, but the terms are very flexible as to when those repayments start to occur. So, for instance, if the property doesn't cash flow to a certain point until year 8, year 12, that's when we usually start those payments. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. Okay.
Did I answer your full question?
Yeah. I think without having had a project go through the pipeline at Host myself, I wasn't sure of how that works in detail. I just have, been hearing some grumblings around in the industry.
I
So
would like to talk with you more about that.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, thanks. But that makes sense and seems very logical to me.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks for asking it.
And Masha? I think you're still on mute, Masha. Thank you.
I'm trying to click the right buttons here. I wanted to just simply ask, I heard the One Home System, the Metro Deep Homelessness partnership, but my question is, how is these systems or support being translated to the individual that is experiencing homelessness or on the verge of being homeless? How are we being transparent to let individuals know? I mean, I think one of my concerns is that these things are out there. We know they're out there, but in terms of the people that we service, how are we relaying that information to them?
Yeah, I think a big part of what you see reflected in the action plan is just that very thing, that we need to firm up what we call access points and ways that people experiencing homelessness can get, kind of front door access to whatever the resources might be to help them. Towards that end, in 2021, we've piloted a new program with the Salvation Army called the Connection Center to help increase access and sort of screening for families. Starting in 2020, St. Francis Center received some funding to beef up their access point activities for individuals. But it shows up again in our action planning and in our strategic planning because it's still not quite there, right? Like the experience for the person who's facing a crisis can still feel like a lot to navigate in spite of all the improvements that have been made on the back end. And so definitely hear you and agree with you. And we're really trying to work to improve that for our partners. Wanted to let you all know we also have just filled 2 new positions on the homelessness resolution team under Midori's supervision. So one is a family homelessness program officer. So someone who is specifically focused on this system and how they're working together or not, and how we're able to make a better experience for families when they're facing a big housing crisis. And then the other is a rehousing program officer. So their work is really thinking about across the whole system, how are we getting better at connecting folks on the street and in our shelters to housing outcomes, and how do we make sure that we're better communicating all the resources and opportunities kind of at every program and touch point along the way. So we've on our part have done what we can to try and staff up and provide more assistance and support to the system to improve it.
And if I can just add in there, I think one of the other things you'll see in the operations section in support of that from the communications and community engagement team is 2 strategies. One is around really expanding our web presence of what the services and supports are that are available. And so we actually have a new web hub that we are launching hopefully on November 1st, and really excited about how that resource is going to help connect people not only to the services and supports that we and our partners provide at Host, but also across the city. So including other agency resources. And a second strategy that we're pursuing with Angie's team is to really dive in with our outreach workers to find out what additional materials they need when they are out in the field working with people on the ground to find out, if they need little handout cards or things that would help them better articulate what the options are that we have available and how to best access those. So we're spending some time really finding out from them where we might have gaps in some of those materials so that we can help provide them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I welcome if there is any opportunity to have any information on these steps for individuals that's experiencing homelessness. We have a platform where we can reach out to people. There's a platform within DHS, Denver Human Services. There's outreach, there's community. We just literally will be starting the community impact division. And I welcome this information to get to the ground level, because first off, our families are struggling with too many hoops to jump through. And here is yet another one. Someone might know of this secret passage that can provide them with shelter. And it's difficult because you can't believe everything you hear. And a lot of these items are, already funding is gone, or the funding hasn't started yet, or something. And here's these more hurdles. So if there is information, I'm often out in the community, typically 3 to 4 times a week at some kind of community function. I welcome, just send me an email. We have about 7,000 people that is on the Community Connections email. We need to get this information to the people that is in need of the service. It's great. If I worked at Metro Denver, I know it, but I don't know how I can get the people where I'm at, even if that's a phone call, if it's a visit. I've been on some of the sites recently, and it is very difficult to navigate through.
We'll
So
definitely
thank
take you up on that, Marcia. I think that's one of the things that Sabrina has been a really good leader on is hearing directly from people experiencing homelessness to make sure that we are improving how we make that accessible. I was recently talking to a woman I've known for 21 years here in Denver, and she came to me and said, Britta, I think I've been experiencing homelessness, and it just reinforces that the labels that we use as professionals in the space doesn't always translate to a person who's in that housing crisis and has had those challenges. And so I think we have to keep learning how to reach more and more people, because we want to be person-centered and not just system-centered. And so I really appreciate that perspective. And also, can you all hear me now? I restarted.
Yes.
You're a little low, unless you lost your
Okay.
voice a little bit, Britta.
It's a little quiet, but we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Great.
We got you.
I want to
Thank
be mindful of time. Daryl, we've only got about 10 minutes left on the time we scheduled today. So
Correct. So I wanted to see if Kuika or Thomas, and then I have one follow-up, and then Sabrina, I know you have some policy pieces you may want to maybe close us out with. But Kuika, if you're with us, and Thomas, any questions? And these are specific to the action plans, the specifics that Jennifer just walked us through.
I honestly, I don't have any questions as of right now. That's just
Okay.
I'm on board, so.
Thank you, Kuika.
That was a lot of information to digest and to process. I'm sure some questions may arise once I, fully go over the documents and, process this information, but I am on board. It looks good and great so far, so no questions for me.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. And I know Britta has her hands up, so Britta, I'll turn it back to you, and then I'll close with a follow-up as well.
Thanks, Daryl. I just wanted to ask some specific feedback. We presented the information about the American Rescue Plan Act, the recovery funds. I wanted to make sure for you as Housing Stability Strategic Advisors, does the course that we've set with those funds make sense? Is there anything that you are surprised about or feel is missing in that we need to think about as we deploy these recovery funds that we already know about?
Britta, I'll jump in and I, from the action targeting and specific to the operations piece, I believe there is an opportunity with the transition for the EIT, the early intervention team, to host. There is an opportunity now, whether it requires more funding or it requires just more systems, to really increase kind of a focus on Built for Zero as it pertains beyond veterans. I think it's important. I think it's almost essential with the investments from the bonds, from the federal dollars, that we really have a clearer view of how many folks are actually on the streets outside of the point of contact listing. And then we can actually look at really from that specific number, which would be closer to a Built for Zero type model, maybe leveraging the EIT team. We can then look at how those services and those dollars are actually moving or supporting folks through the systems. So that would be one thing I would look for, seeing how the team is, whether changing systems or adding additional dollars and people to the EIT team, ensuring the data integrity that they're putting into HMIS as they support the Denver street outreach teams, and then walking that through the process of moving folks from unsheltered to housing that we're supporting. So that's one piece that I would love to see, maybe more identification of funds or systems changes, especially with the EIT moving over.
Thanks for that feedback, Daryl. Jenny, it looks like you might have some thoughts too.
I just wanted to reiterate, I guess, that, and I think the city is actually doing a good job of this. I know for the state, we're trying to, as they're thinking about ARPA funds, we're really trying to hammer home this message that they should be used for the people most impacted by COVID, and those most disproportionately impacted. And so I appreciate that the cities are being targeted to those activities for those populations. And I think just continuing to ensure that that's the case is really important. So thanks.
Thanks for that feedback, Jenny. That's very valuable.
Great. I was going to do some policy updates. We wanted to just give you a little heads up on ballot measures. I think I'm going to hold those and maybe we'll just send those to you via email. We may be pushing those out in our newsletter as well. So I'll just skip that since we're short on time today. And then just a reminder that we'll be having further discussion about the Expanding Housing Affordability Program at your January meeting, with more of a briefing around what they're doing with that and how that connects to our work. And then lastly, I think Elvis sent out this morning a press release from Community Planning and Development that talks a little bit more about the linkage fee and how that's the proposals that they are putting forward on that. So those were my updates. And then I will just kick it back to you, Daryl, to do closings and any kind of comments.
One question on expanding housing affordability, and Elvis, thank you for sending what you sent. Can you also include kind of the transition from the initial inclusionary housing process to linkage fee to the new inclusionary housing? Is there a way to see really what the changes are, kind of the why back to inclusionary housing from the linkage fee? I think some of the folks maybe within HSSA, and I know myself, it will be very helpful for us to see the transition, to walk through to each iteration, and kind of why this is and I know we'll have the full presentation in January, but why this is really a better place for the city to be going back to the inclusionary housing and having very specific targets as far as affordability based on the changes within the state. I know it's a lot, but would love for that to be added instead of just simply the data as to what they are, but the transition, how they intersect, and what that growth looks like. So with that, thank you so much, host, for the presentation. We know that at the January meeting, there's a lot of stuff that we're going to be hitting. we want to ask you from, at least from HSSA perspective, once we receive this information, I know as a team, we're going to really dive into it so that throughout the presentation, especially on expanding housing affordability, that members, similar to Thomas's statement, that members of HSSA are prepared to really dive deeper into the dialogue at the meeting instead of having to come back, and then to begin that action planning in January. So I want to thank everyone from host for the time in preparing for this meeting. This was not a planned discussion. I know that the budget process came a little bit different this year for us. I'd like to thank the members of HSSA for coming prepared to have dialogue, and the members of the community. We know that in January, we'll have a public comment process where you're going to be able to engage a little bit more richly in this dialogue as well. So this meeting, once again, was one that we are planning to ensure we had a full discussion of the budget or a full hearing of the budget, and for HSSA to be able to engage with the city on that. So with that, thank you so much. For members of HSSA, expect a doodle poll for a informal get together before the holidays, so we can really build community internally, and we invite everyone on the call, the members of host, if you would like to attend. We'll make sure you know when and where we're meeting at informally to try to get to know each other. So thank you again. Thank you, Britta and team. I'll turn it over to you to maybe close out the call.
Thanks, Daryl. We've got a lot of great work to do, and thank you all for your advisement and for supporting this work and telling our community about how these dollars are being deployed and these resources are available to help people in our community right now. So thank you again, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Team.
Thanks, everyone.